Hi, I'm Han Brown, the host of the Boomer Living broadcast. On the show, we discuss in depth topics that are relevant to baby boomers. We identify challenges and opportunities so that we can better serve this generation. Today's topic is why America thinks your age is a big deal. Well, we are a youth obsessed culture that is always looking for the next best thing. This can be seen in the way that we talk about aging. We often use words like elderly or senior citizen to describe older adults as if they are a different species. This othering creates a sense of distance between us and them, which can lead to negative attitudes and stereotypes. Ageism is a form of discrimination that is based on age. It can affect anyone, regardless of actual age. One of the most common examples is the way that we treat older adults. We often assume they are not as capable as younger people, and this can lead to them being overlooked and ignored. Ageism can also affect caregiving, as older adults may be less likely to receive care if they are perceived as being a burden. Generational labels are another example of ageism. They are often used to divide people into groups based on their age, which can create feelings of competition or hostility between different generations. And the term successful aging is also problematic, as it suggests that there is a right and wrong way to age. Elderhood is a better way to talk about older age than retirement, as it acknowledges the many contributions that older adults make to society. It also recognizes that aging is a natural process that should be celebrated, not feared. So today, my guest is Tracy Gendron. So Dr. Tracy Gendron is a highly respected gerontologist and author who is dedicated to understanding and raising awareness of ageism. She has written the book Ageism Unmasked, Exploring Age Bias and How to End It. Her research focuses on the language and expression of ageism, as well as elderhood as a stage of development. Dr. Gendron's personal and professional goal is to understand and deeply embedded, normalize. Dr. Gendron's personal and professional goal is to understand and disrupt the deeply embedded, normalized, and invisible ageism that exists within all of us. So, Dr. Tracy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here, Han.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So, how are you and where are you calling from?
Today, I am calling from outside of Richmond, Virginia, in a little town called Midlothian, and it is just a beautiful fall day here.
Yeah, nice. We were there over the summer, Virginia.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, we crossed by. I love it. Kids had a nice time. But over here, we had some snow in Michigan.
Already. Wow.
Yeah.
You're getting a jump start.
Yeah. So, what would you like the listeners to know about you professionally and personally?
So, I think you did a great introduction. So, thank you for that. I am a gerontologist. So, that means that I have a master's degree in gerontology, which I received about 25 years ago or so. So, I have been kind of in this space of thinking about aging from a holistic perspective, a biopsychosocial spiritual perspective for much of my life. At this point, I am chair of the Department of Gerontology at Virginia Commonwealth University and director of the Virginia Center on Aging. And ageism is something that I came to about a decade ago or so, when I really started to see for the first time how deeply embedded ageism was, not only in the culture, but also within me. So I think much of my path has been this dual reflection of wanting to understand it, but also really wanting to personally examine it and challenge it within myself. And I think that has, been the driver for a lot of my work.
Hmm. I echo that. I think too much of it is innate and we don't even realize it. So I think the more that we talk about it honestly with ourselves, and admit that we can be ageism towards our loved ones and towards ourselves, and be a part of that, breaking the paradigm.
Yes,
So, yeah,
exactly.
thank you so much for what you do.
Thank
And
you.
you know, we will all likely become victims of ageism eventually. Why do you think that don't more people care about it?
I'm not sure it's that people don't care about it. I think people don't know about it. I think
Mm.
there's a real lack of awareness. And what I'm learning as I, speak to more and more people about this topic, is that ageism is it's omnidirectional. So it means it is directed towards older people, but it's also very much directed towards younger people. And it's
Mhm.
a vicious cycle that we have created. And I think once people understand what ageism is, what it looks like, that it's even a thing, and you explain to them why it matters, then people do care. But until people have the knowledge of what it really looks like and the consequences, I don't think that they recognize that it's something that they need to pay attention to or that has any kind of negative influence on them. So it's usually an aha moment for people when I start to explain the consequences of ageism. And then that kind of opens the door to maybe I should care about this.
Very true. And how do you think, I guess, ageism and narcissism related?
I've never been asked that question before, and I love that question. So when I think about narcissism, to me, that's kind of an unhealthy obsession with self,
Hmm.
and really prioritizing certain aspects of ourself, like how we look compared to other people, how much money we have compared to other people. So I think ageism and narcissism probably could go hand in hand when we're thinking about the fact that we live in a youth obsessed culture. And therefore, we become seen as less beautiful, as less valuable, as less successful as we age. And I can definitely see that as a challenge, especially for people that are higher in narcissism. But what an interesting relationship to be able to look at. So I love that question because it's one I'd never thought of until you asked it.
Hmm. Yeah, there's some similarities,
Yeah.
and I think it's important to bring it to light because it is related.
Yes.
It's not one or the other, they're intertwined. So it's certainly
Absolutely.
something that we can improve in ourselves and break away from it. And I think we're all victims of it, let's face it, right?
Yes. Very much so.
Yeah. Um, so, you know, we reach a certain age, we're suddenly seen as less capable, less valuable. And then we think about, gee, why is there so much innate ageism? I don't know where it starts, but I know it's there. Um, Maybe it's when people, let's say, hit retirement age, they're no longer seen as productive members of society. Or maybe it's even sooner than that when we start to experience age related changes like wrinkles and gray hair and so forth. So, whatever the cause of age, of what it is, certainly it's a real problem. As you have mentioned, it's harmful to individuals and society. On an individual level, I think it can lead to feelings of depression,
Mhm.
worthlessness,
Mhm.
decreased opportunities in work and social life. And then it leads, I think, for society, ageism leads to a waste of human potential and resources. So, talk about innate ageism. How do we work among ourselves and others to, do a better job in that?
Absolutely. So you really very well described the complexities of ageism because you're right. It is externally driven, meaning it's how we see other people based on their age. And it's also internally driven, meaning it's how we see ourselves as an aging person and how we view the process of growing older. And there's different consequences that go with both of those. When it comes to the, innate, there's a couple of ways I can talk about that. The first is that we live in such an ageist society, and there have been a lot of different events and historical experiences that have happened that have gotten us to this period of time. It's all in the book. That's actually what my book really talks about. But essentially, the way that we have built society really makes older people others. Retirement plays a role in that. Again, you said it well. We start to see people as not contributors, as not productive. Even the term retirement itself really describes a withdrawal from
Mm-hmm.
society. Retirement tells me you used to work. It is a role and a position that describes something you used to do. It does
Mm-hmm.
not talk about what you are actively doing. It is not a
Right.
strengths-based term. So that coupled with kind of these cultural messages that we have an anti-aging industry, as you said, an obsession with youth, is that ageism becomes kind of invisible. So then it becomes internally directed, where we believe that there's a lot of shame associated with growing older or looking older or acting older. And so you're right, when we internalize those messages, what that ends up leading to is actually the very things that we fear. It can lead
Mm-hmm.
to memory loss. It can lead to decline in our cognition. It can lead to social isolation. It can lead to depression. And these are all things that are not normal and expected parts of aging, but that we can certainly manifest when we're carrying around a lifetime of stress and fear related to aging. So the innateness of it in society becomes invisibly internalized, and that then
Mm-hmm.
internalization creates manifestation of the things that we fear the most. So it's a fascinating kind of, cycle that we create. And how do you break it? The first thing you do is recognize that aging is not a process of decline alone. Aging is a process of decline, growth, maintenance, and adaptation. And once
Mm-hmm.
we start to see that aging is not just about our bodies, that's a part of it. Aging is about our psyche. It's about our relationship with spirituality. It's about our social position in the world. It's about our psyche and our growth. Once you start to see that, you can start to reframe the way you think about aging. And that's a very healthy place to start.
Mm-hmm. It's our entirety, right? It's
Yes.
all. It's the wholeness of who
It's
we
the
are.
wholeness. Exactly. It's about all of it. But we're trained to think aging is decline. We see slopes like this, that aging is a
Mm-hmm.
downward trajectory, but it's not. We grow our entire lives. We keep changing our entire lives. In fact, older people are often much happier because they've come into themselves, because they're more comfortable in their own skin, despite having health challenges. So these are the things that we need to talk about. And if everybody could take away one thing, that would be the thing I'd want them to take away, is that aging is beautifully complicated
Mm-hmm.
and that we can embrace that.
Absolutely, and it's not one dimensional.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. Well, I kind of know where the next question is going. However, I still want to hear your take. People are afraid of aging, okay, for obvious reasons. But let's talk about that. Let's bring all those reasons and let's debunk those reasons. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So first, I think that a lot of what you've said so far, when it comes to the fear of losses and the fear of decline, is that we have to acknowledge that ableism is a part yet separate phenomenon from ageism. So ableism is when we discriminate against people based on level of ability or inability. And I think a lot of us carry around fears of losing ability. And that's internalized ableism, not internalized ageism. So I just think it's important to kind of talk about both of these things because they exist in the same space. And in part because, as I said before, aging does mean our bodies will change and our bodies will decline in some ways because we're mortal. So
Hmm.
there's a different kind of fear that is associated with that that's rooted in ableism, and ageism kind of exacerbates it. So I think that's a point that's really important for people to think about, is that there's different kind of layers and levels of those fears and anxieties.
Hmm. Very true. So, who do you think is most affected by ageism?
I think all people are affected by ageism. I think it just
Mhm.
presents differently for different people. So, we'll talk about gendered ageism and how ageism impacts women versus men. I think that their messages about success for men and women are very different, but the
Mhm.
shame directed at them can be somewhat similar. So for women, I think they often feel both invisible and hypervisible at the same time. Clearly, there's economic consequences for women where over a lifetime, because of wage differences, they make less, they can be more income insecure. They can be at risk for all different kinds of issues in later life. Men are also shamed sometimes in different ways about being a provider or a caregiver. The products that are really directed towards men are really about shaming about virility, and that's part of a man's identity. So gendered ageism, is there for people of all genders, for people that fall anywhere on the gender identity spectrum, but are different. And then when you add on other aspects of identity, like race and ethnicity and sexual orientation, those compound because aging is individual for each person. Each person is going to experience it differently, but it's also dependent on all of the forms of our identity. So each person, depending on who they are, is going to have their own unique risk factors and protective factors.
Very true. So let's talk about respect in older adults. What is your take on that, especially in today's society?
I think there's generally a lack of, I think that where we have gone as a society is seeing a lot of older people as out of touch or irrelevant or incompetent. This is especially true given that we live in a very technological society and that a lot of older people didn't grow up using the technology that we have today. So I think in that way, there's definitely a lack of respect. But if you go to some of the ancient texts, some like Judeo-Christian Bible, and some cultures, there's definitely a respect built in for older people. And wisdom was venerated, and older people were seen as leaders in their churches or their temples or whatever their institution was. And I do think there's pockets of that as well. I think there's a lot of family members that have a lot of reverence for the elders in their families. So I think there's a contradiction that's there, is that societally we've pushed people away as others, but there are still pockets where people are talking about the value of older people. And I think that needs to start to bleed through into more societal level conversations.
Absolutely. And I think what adds to ageism is that, as we get older, some may become set in their ways and resistant to change. This can make people seem inflexible or out of touch with the younger generation. That notion adds to the ageism. And then, of course, the obvious is that our culture values youth and beauty above all. I think ageism, it exists because perhaps that is an easy way to justify discrimination and prejudice. I mean, if we can convince ourselves that someone is too old or past their prime, then it becomes easier to treat them differently or even mistreat them. What do you think?
I think you're exactly right. I think it's a lazy way of looking at the world, because that way you don't have to look at that person that is actually in front of you for everything that they bring. And I understand it. Look, we have a lot of different stimuli that's coming at us at the same time, and our brains are designed for bias. Our brains are designed to label and categorize people. And if you go all the way back, it's a survival mechanism. But now we have the ability to step back for a moment and challenge what our brain is telling us about this category or label or stereotype. It takes a little bit of work, but it's certainly possible. And it is a lazy way of taking a shortcut to something. So to assume that anybody of any age likes or dislikes or is, good at something or bad at something is just so misleading. Definitely perpetuates the stereotypes of both older and younger people that often don't fit the mark of the person that you're talking to.
Absolutely. And then there's this notion that, older adults, they lose value and worth, and they see youth as a time of hope and possibility when you can be anything and do anything. And there's this pressure to achieve things by a certain age, right? Which I think contributes to ageism. But those are very subtle that we don't really take notice until we're in the later years, right?
Yeah, I do think a lot of younger people are starting to notice too. I
Mm.
do. When I do these talks, I hear a lot of younger people say they feel as if they have been discriminated against in all kinds of environments because they're perceived as too young to understand something or
Mm.
not have enough experience. Or so I think they are starting to feel it as well, which is a good thing. Not that there's ageism everywhere, but that people are starting to get a clue as to what it looks like and how
Mhm.
we can challenge it. I think that's really important. And as you said, it can be very insidious and very
Mhm.
invisible, masked as a compliment. That happens all the time. You know, you look
Mhm.
great for your age. You haven't aged a bit. Where
Mhm.
people say, "Oh, thank you. You look so young. You can't possibly
Mhm.
be however old you are." They're masked as compliments. So it can be very hard to identify and then hard to challenge.
Mhm.
But yeah, but as we have these conversations with people, we are doing the work of raising awareness, you know, and letting
Mhm.
people know, hey, wait, no, I need you to think about this. I need you to, you know, really recognize when you're experiencing ageism and when you're perpetuating ageism, because we all do it.
Right. Very true. All right, so let's talk about successful aging. I don't even like
Mm.
that word, but let's talk about that.
It's
So,
terrible.
what's your take? Why is it problematic?
It's problematic for a couple different reasons. So, the way that we have defined successful aging is that you're maintaining your independence, you are maintaining your physical abilities, your cognitive abilities, and you're really engaged. And that's great. And there are some people that are going to fit that to a T. But the problem is because aging does have some level of decline, eventually we will all fail. If you define successful aging as the ability to maintain, we're not
Mhm.
going to be able to maintain, but that doesn't mean we're not successful. So, this really to me speaks to this intersection of ageism and ableism. We can have physical limitations, we can have cognitive limitations, and we can still be successful. We get to define what success means to us. And I think we get to define that at all ages and stages. So, what is successful to you now may not be what you define as success 10 years from now or 20
Right.
years from now, because it certainly isn't what you defined for yourself when you were 10. What was
Mhm.
successful then doesn't match what is successful now. So I think we need to stop thinking about how other people define success for us and really think about what it means for ourselves. And that can be freeing. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
can be very liberating and empowering.
So true. Instead of living under the succumb with the pressure, let's say to stay fit or active, which I'm in favor of, but it's the pressure is the issue that you have to stay fit and active, have a successful career, to be able to financially stable, to be emotionally happy and fulfilled, and to maintain social relationships, all of which are very good. But
Yeah,
it's overwhelming and exhausting just to try to keep up with all of that. So I
exactly.
think it's especially hard for older adults because they're already dealing with age-related changes and losses,
Yes.
right? And then compounding that all the pressures of the right way to age. So
Yes.
it's insensitive
It is, and
when.
it's narrow. It's just a very narrow definition. And you're right. I think that health promotion is a good thing. Taking care of
Mhm.
ourselves, eating well, drinking enough water, getting enough sleep, you know, these are all really good things for our health and they do extend longevity. But being shamed into it does not
Yeah,
help. And having
right.
one narrow definition doesn't help. So, like, for example, some people may say, if I get to retirement, that's success. I have succeeded because I can afford to retire. Somebody else might say, I don't ever want to retire. I love working. I love the purpose that it gives me. Somebody else might say, I can't afford to retire. You can't prioritize one definition of success over the others when they have three very different situations and three very different needs. So, yeah, you said it very well.
And I like these conversations because it makes people start thinking. It's not a simple thing. We're victims and we're also perpetrators as well. So I think
Yes.
it's important. that we talk about the complexity of aging and all of the different issues that come with it, like we are right now. And we need to normalize the aging process and have a more realistic expectation about what it means to each and every one of us, not what it means to everybody, right? It's very personal.
Exactly. And if you want to go really deep, if you want to take it a step deeper, I think we also need to talk about why we fear dependency, why we see
Mm-hmm.
being dependent as a failure, when the truth is we are always dependent on other people. We are not independent creatures, we are interdependent creatures. And
Mm-hmm.
from the moment we're born, we rely on other people, but we see dependency as a failure. And then underneath that is also fear of death. So there's a lot to it. It's a very rich and deep topic, and not one that you can just think about once and say, okay, I got it. This takes a lot of unpacking to do because of the levels that are involved in it.
Mm-hmm. Emotionally, mentally, physically, in all regards, and it's intertwined. It's a complex matter, you
Yes,
know?
exactly.
Um, so, how does ageism affect caregiving? That's a big issue.
It is. And I think that, that does speak to some of the burden language that I was talking about and the fear of dependency. So I like to give this example because in the book, I found this fascinating when I was doing the research that we started to separate caregiving and parenting like in the 19th century, around the time of the Industrial Revolution. We started to think of paid caregivers and the profession of nursing as kind of stepping in to care for our older parents and loved ones. And so this term caregiving kind of started to come around. It didn't get formalized till later, um, became more associated with a burden, right? So older people became a burden. We outsourced it. We put them into segregated housing, sometimes institutional living, and we paid caregivers. Whereas we started to talk about parenting as kind of this natural um, transition that we do when we have children that is expected. We expect that we're going to parent. That is our responsibility. But we don't talk about parenting only as a burden. We talk about in terms of being challenging with great rewards at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. So we can flip that for caregiving for older people as well. It is challenging. It can also be extraordinarily rewarding. So I think that we have pathologized what it means to give care to other people. We have made it into something that older people receive rather than a
Yeah.
relationship that they develop with people. Because even
Mm-hmm.
when you're receiving care, you are giving back to people.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of a relational thing, and that again others older people, and it marginalizes the people that provide care for older people. And we even see that in, wage discrepancies. The people that work to care for older people are generally underpaid and undervalued. So that's systemic discrimination, ageism, when it's looking
Mm-hmm.
at the whole system.
Gosh, I couldn't say that better myself. But, with regards to caregiving, I truly believe every single one of us, if we're not already a caregiver or a
We will
caregivee
be.
on the receiving end, you will.
Yep.
You will. I'm
Yep.
confident of that.
Absolutely. You will get or you will give or both, and at multiple points in your life, not just at
Mm-hmm.
one point.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So to normalize that and to talk about, maximizing that, again, not to acknowledge it can be very challenging. Parenting can be very challenging, but to say there's also great reward that come with it and to develop the support structures to help people, to help give them the external support that they need to do it, that would be a much more productive way to go and a much more productive conversation to have.
Right. There's a give and take, there's relational, there's rewards. And I think we have to, uncover that and speak to that more so than a burden.
Exactly.
No easy task. Certainly no easy task.
Absolutely.
I'm living through it in multiple ways in my life, but you have to really reset your thinking to honor and to celebrate as opposed to feel it's a burden, you know.
Exactly.
Um,
Yes.
okay, so let's talk about ending ageism in the caregiving industry. We talked about a little bit, but what ways can we do as an industry to promote caregivers? What's your take?
I think that, we're starting to have some of these conversations, and I think there's kind of two parallel conversations here. One is about more family caregivers and providing them with the supports and services that they need. So I think there's kind of community-based strategies that we're going to need, that give people options for respite, that can help provide them with some of the gaps in resources that they may have, that provide them with support from nonprofit institutions that can come in and help with management of certain tasks and issues. And then also, respecting the caregiving process with things like paid leave from work for people, not just for childcare, but for elder care, for any care. So I think there's the supporting the family caregivers, but then I think there's a separate issue in supporting professional caregivers. And I think we need to do some serious advocacy and policy work. And since COVID, we have seen much more effort put on getting direct care staff and professional caregivers higher wages. We're seeing more of an emphasis on creating supportive environments for them so that they feel valued, on having them have the benefits of a full-time job so they don't have to hop around from job to job. And I think we're going to need a lot more investment in that as well. If you go into any kind of age segregated community, you should look at how happy the staff are, because that directly translates into the quality of care that people are getting. We have to invest in the caregivers. We have to invest in the staff, in their health, in their well-being, in their happiness. And we still have a ways to go to be able to do that. But I am happy that conversations have started. And I believe that's the first step to getting there.
I agree. I think COVID has been a big revealer.
Yeah.
If people didn't know already some of these problems existed, well, they certainly do after COVID. And I hate to even say it, there's some good that came out of it, and this is one of them. It's been a great
Absolutely.
revealer for all. So
Absolutely.
let's talk about generational labels. How is that ageist?
Ooh, I love this question. So generational labels are very misleading. And to me, again, when we're talking about a lazy way to categorize somebody, using a generational label to me is a very lazy shortcut. So generational labels are largely arbitrary. When you think about it, other than the baby boomers, who were called the baby boomers because the birth rate spiked in the years 1946 to 64, other ones, it's kind of like flexible as to when a Gen Xer is, when a Gen Zer is, when a millennial is. There's even kind of different definitions of it. But basically, you're taking this arbitrary 20-year period, 15 to 20-year period, and you're saying, well, everybody born within that 20-year period must have the same likes, dislikes, needs, preferences, abilities, because they are a baby boomer, because they were born within that same period. That makes no sense. When we talk about individuality and we talk about how people experience events and historical events differently, talk about people's levels of identity that they carry with them, there is no way that people in a 20-year span have the same likes, dislikes, preferences. It just doesn't make sense. So when we, use things like boomer, and what they have turned into is a catch-all, like okay boomer, to dismiss someone, to minimize someone.
Tsunami.
The tsunami, when we talk about millennial, whether it's a millennial or not, we're categorizing people as lazy, as entitled. You again are perpetuating bias. You are perpetuating this view of somebody based on a single arbitrary definition. And it takes you farther and farther away from seeing the unique person in front of you. So I think generations are helpful in talking about maybe some historical context and talking about maybe even some demographic trends, but not the way that we currently talk about it.
Yes.
I have strong feelings about this.
No, I do too. I do too. I mean, there's a time and place for it, just like you said, in history, right? And breaking down to demographics. Because certainly there's many cohorts. You can't label all of that under one. And I
Correct.
think People are obsessed with labeling generations because it makes complex issues feel manageable. When you
Correct.
put something into a neat little box, it's easier to understand and deal with.
Yes.
And maybe it's a way of belonging. When you can identify with a group of people, you feel like you're a part of something larger than yourself.
Yes.
But there's a lot of downside. Okay.
Yes. A
The
lot of
labels
down.
limiting.
Yes.
It
That's a
makes
great
like you
word
got to
for it.
conform.
Yes. Yeah. I love the
You got
word
to
limiting
conform.
and
Yeah.
conforming. I think those are great ways to describe it. Because yes, it does limit. And when you think about it, how many times have you experienced something with someone else? So let's say you and your best friend both experienced COVID together. I bet you experienced it very differently from your best friend.
Mhm.
I bet the outcomes were very different. Historical influences don't have a blanket effect. And we need
Right.
to take that into account, that each person is going to have their own interpretation of what happened in their own experience. So limiting is the right word for that.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Um, Generational labels have influenced the way we view older adults. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I was just reading something today, an article that was talking about the silent generation and how people in the silent generation don't tend to want to make waves, and that baby boomers, put their, politics up front, and that they really do. And I can think of examples off the top of my head of people that don't fit into those categories well.
Mhm.
So again, I just think that these labels derail us from really looking at the unique needs of each person. And that's why I think those labels are very dangerous.
Mhm. That's true. What about elderhood? Is that a better way to talk about older age than retirement?
I certainly think so. So I think that, as I said before, retirement is very limiting as well. Retirement is a withdrawal based term that basically tells me that you used to work.
Mhm.
Retirement actually is a social institution. Retirement is not a stage of life. So we talk about stages of life. We talk about infancy, we talk about childhood, we talk about adolescence, we talk about adulthood, and then we continue to talk about adulthood. It just goes on and on and on. And now that we're living into our 90s and 100s, that means that we could be in adulthood for what, 70, 80 years of our life, depending on when one becomes an adult, because that's also kind of arbitrary.
Yeah.
I think that elderhood is a term that has purpose, power, and meaning. And it's a
Mhm.
strengths based term that says development in later life is different than development earlier in life. Not that an older person is not an adult, of course they are, but maybe the markers and the milestones and the opportunities are different for older people in elderhood than they are for people earlier in adulthood. And if we could think of that natural shift, like maybe downshifting is a good thing, maybe not being so busy and hurried like we are in adulthood gives us more space to work on ourselves, to build a legacy, to bring peace to the world, to generate wisdom. Wouldn't that be a refreshing way of looking at milestones in elderhood and contributions for elderhood?
Yeah.
The world needs older people. The world needs them for so many reasons. And I think if we started to think about elderhood as a developmental stage, we'd stop thinking about it as just decline and start to think
Mhm.
about it in that much more complex way that we were talking about.
Wow, that's so true. Boy, what a huge paradigm shift that we all need to participate in. You know, um, it starts conversations like this, but we got a long ways to go.
We do. We do. But each conversation helps.
Yeah. So, in closing, do you have anything else that you would like to add?
There's probably a million things that I would like to add, but I'm grateful to have the conversation with you. I'm grateful for you inviting me on. If I could, leave people with one thing, it would be find your reason why this matters. As you said in the very beginning, why don't people care? And I said because I don't think people realize that it has the consequences that it does. So, what I would love for everyone to do is first recognize that ageism is about you. This is about people of all ages and all stages. Number two, recognize that there's a lot of reasons why it matters, including to your health, your happiness, your longevity, the health and happiness and longevity of your loved ones, because you're motivated by justice and you want to create a society that is equitable based on age. Even motivation because it harms businesses, it harms the economy, it harms industries. So there's really no wrong source of motivation, but find your why. Really find your why. And then don't beat yourself up for being ageist, both internally or externally. You have to see it first before you can do anything about it. And be on your journey. Be open to learning about it and to be thinking about it, and realize that this is going to, be a process that unfolds over time. So that's what I would leave
Mhm.
everyone with.
Wow, thank you. That is something that I'm reminding myself. You think you know, but when you start having these conversations, you realize, gee, some of your own behavior need a change as well.
Exactly.
So, in closing, there's no easy way to talk about growing old. It's a complex issue with many different facets, and everyone has their own unique experience with it. For some, growing old is a time of wisdom and reflection. They never felt more confident or sure of themselves. They're comfortable in their skin and they know who they are. They made peace with their past and they're living in the present. They're grateful and for every day, for everyone and every day that they have. But for others, growing old is a time of insecurity and uncertainty. They know or they don't know who they are or what they want in life. They feel like they're just going through the motions, living day to day without any purpose or direction. They're afraid of the future and they mourn the loss of their youth or perhaps a loved one, a spouse. So it's a confusing and often painful time, but it's also a time of growth and discovery. So no matter how you feel about growing old, it's an inevitable part of life and it's something that we all have to go through together. So embrace a journey and be a part of the paradigm shift to debunk the ageism. And thank you so much for your time and until next week.